My parents left all the inheritance to my sister, so I stopped paying their bills. A month later, my mom called. Honey, the rent is overdue. But my answer made her fall silent mid-sentence. Marcus nearly choked on his morning coffee when he opened that damn envelope. 3 years he'd been quietly sliding $800 every month into his parents' account. Not because they asked nicely, but because Mom had this way of making everything sound like a crisis. The electricity might get cut off, she'd say, or, your father's medication costs are killing us. So there he was, reading their will like some kind of sick joke. Delilah got everything. The house, Dad's workshop full of vintage tools he'd been collecting since the 70s, even Grandma's pearl necklace that Marcus had always figured might come to his future wife someday. And him? He got a single line. We appreciate Marcus's past support. Past, like his bank account hadn't been lighter by nearly 30 grand over the last few years. His phone started buzzing before he'd even finished his second cup of coffee. Mom's ringtone, that annoying default one she'd never bothered changing. He let it go to voicemail, then watched it light up again and again. On the fourth call, curiosity got the better of him. Patricia's voice had that familiar edge, the one that meant she needed something but was pretending it wasn't a big deal. The rent was due, Harold's Social Security was late again. Could Marcus just help out this one time? This one time, right. Like the previous 3 years had been some kind of fever dream. Marcus stared at the will still spread across his kitchen table and felt something click into place. Something that felt suspiciously like relief, mixed with a hefty dose of screw this. Delilah's Instagram was a masterclass in irony. Designer handbags, weekend trips to Napa, fancy restaurant check-ins with captions like, living my best life. The girl hadn't visited their parents since before the pandemic, but somehow she was living her best life while Marcus lived his most financially drained one. Her latest post showed off some purse that probably cost more than his monthly car payment. She'd tagged it with a bunch of heart emojis and something about grateful for all my blessings. Marcus screenshot that shit and opened his banking app. Row after row of $800 transfers stared back at him like a personal history of being taken for granted. $28,800. That was almost a down payment on a decent place. When his phone rang again with Mom's number, he was ready for her. The conversation went about as well as you'd expect. Patricia started with her usual guilt trip routine. Why hadn't he called back? They were so worried. The landlord was getting nasty about the late rent. Marcus kept his voice steady, almost businesslike. According to the will, he explained, his support was considered past support. Since Delilah was inheriting everything, maybe she should handle the present stuff too. Dead silence. For a second, Marcus thought the call had dropped. Then Mom started backpedaling, saying the will was about later, about after they died, not about right now. But Marcus had already done the math. They'd planned their future around Delilah. Time for them to plan their present around her too. Dad jumped on the line then, his voice doing that gruff thing it did when he felt cornered. Started going on about how the will was just about keeping property in the family, nothing personal, blah blah blah. Marcus let him talk, really listened actually, and what he heard was pretty revealing. Every excuse boiled down to the same assumption, that Marcus would keep paying because that's what Marcus did. Reliable old Marcus, always good for a bailout. The call ended with Marcus saying he needed to focus on his own finances now. If they needed help, Delilah was clearly the better choice given her new status as the family's golden child. After he hung up, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years, like someone had finally let him put down a suitcase he'd been carrying around forever. Delilah's meltdown via text was actually pretty entertaining. 23 messages in the span of 2 hours, ranging from, "How could you do this to them?" to, "The house isn't liquid money, you idiot." Marcus read through them while eating lunch, kind of amazed at how quickly his sister had gone from grateful Instagram princess to panicked reality checker. Apparently, their parents had been blowing up her phone all morning, and she was not handling the pressure well. Her final message was classic Delilah. You need to keep helping them until I figure this out. Need to. like she was still giving him orders from her position as the family favorite. Marcus deleted the whole conversation and went back to his sandwich, best meal he'd had in months. That weekend, Marcus did something crazy. He went apartment hunting. For himself. For the first time in 5 years, he actually calculated what he could afford without factoring in his parents' monthly drain on his bank account. The place he ended up falling for had huge windows and a view of downtown that made him feel like maybe he wasn't such a loser after all. The rent was almost exactly what he'd been paying between his current dump and his family obligations combined. While he filled out the application, his phone kept buzzing with calls from Mom. He declined every single one and signed his name with this weird sense of finally doing something for himself. The eviction notice hit his parents' mailbox on a Friday. Mom called within an hour, and this time she sounded genuinely scared instead of just manipulative. 24 hours to pay up or get out. Marcus listened to her paint this whole picture of elderly homelessness and community shame and Dad's weak heart. When she finally stopped for breath, he asked the obvious question, "Did you call Delilah?" The pause told him everything. Yeah, she'd called. Delilah needed time to liquidate some assets. Could Marcus just cover one more month? One more month. Like this was some kind of temporary blip instead of the natural consequence of their choices. Marcus actually laughed, not a bitter laugh, a genuinely amused one. Here was Delilah, sitting on a $200,000 house with no mortgage, claiming she needed time to figure out how to help with $800 in rent. His answer was simple. Their living situation was between them and Delilah now. He was out of the family finance business. Mom's voice went sharp then, calling him vindictive and cruel. Said the will had nothing to do with current help, that he was punishing them for planning ahead. Marcus pointed out that their planning had made their priorities pretty damn clear. They'd valued Delilah enough to set her up for life. Time for her to return the favor. The next few days were weird in the best possible way. Marcus slept better, ate better, even started calling friends he'd been blowing off because family drama sucked up all his energy. He bought groceries without calculating how much he had left after his monthly Marcus tax to his parents. Then the extended family got involved. Apparently, Mom had been working the phones, painting him as the heartless son who abandoned his poor old parents. His phone lit up with texts from relatives who hadn't given a damn about his financial situation for the past 3 years, but suddenly had opinions about family duty. Marcus read through them all and felt more sure of his decision than ever. Funny how none of these concerned family members had offered to chip in when he was carrying the whole load himself. The intervention was almost funny. Aunt Rebecca, Uncle Tom, and Cousin Jennifer showed up at his apartment Tuesday night like some kind of family SWAT team. They'd clearly rehearsed their speeches about duty and values and doing the right thing. Marcus made coffee and listened politely while they explained why he needed to reconsider. When they finished, he walked them through the numbers, $28,800 over 3 years, while Delilah got everything valuable in return. You could literally watch the math sink in. Rebecca's face went through about 5 different expressions. Tom started suggesting maybe Delilah could get a loan against the house. Marcus nodded agreeably. Sounded like a plan. Between Delilah and the parents, of course. Delilah lasted exactly 4 days with their parents living in her house. 4 days before she called Marcus crying about invaded privacy and disrupted routines. Apparently, Mom and Dad were treating her place like a hotel and criticizing everything from her cooking to her decorating choices. She wanted him to resume the payment so they could go back to their apartment. She'd even tried to get a loan against the house, but discovered Dad had taken out some kind of lien years ago that complicated everything. When Marcus said no, Delilah lost it completely, accused him of orchestrating the whole mess out of spite, of using their parents as pawns in some revenge fantasy. That one stung because it wasn't entirely wrong, but being partially right and completely hypocritical wasn't a great look on his sister. Marcus hung up on her mid-rant, something he'd never done to family before. The quiet afterward felt huge, like stepping out of a noisy restaurant into fresh air. He'd been so busy being the responsible one that he'd never stopped to ask whether his responsibility was actually helping anyone. His parents had managed before his money started flowing. They'd made spending choices, saving choices, planning choices that led them here. Most importantly, they'd made the choice to value Delilah's future over his sacrifice. That was information he could work with. The anger he'd been carrying around for weeks finally settled into something cleaner: acceptance. He accepted that his family saw him as a solution, not a person. Time to start being a person instead. Dad's call came on a Saturday morning, and his voice sounded different, smaller, somehow. No demands this time, no justifications. Just something that might have been an apology if you squinted at it right. He admitted they'd taken Marcus for granted, assumed his help would always be there, because it always had been. The will was written years ago, when they thought Marcus was more settled financially, better able to handle his own problems. Marcus listened without interrupting, feeling something shift in his chest. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe understanding. His father was human, flawed, capable of mistakes and limited thinking. When Harold finished, Marcus found himself speaking more gently than he'd expected to. Marcus told his father he understood the reasoning, but understanding didn't change the reality. He'd spent 3 years putting their comfort ahead of his own goals. The will had shown him exactly where he ranked in their priorities, and he'd adjusted his behavior to match. Harold asked if there was a way forward that didn't end with the family torn apart. Marcus thought about it seriously. He was willing to have a relationship, but not a financial obligation. That was Delilah's job now. The heir got the benefits and the burdens. The conversation ended without drama, but also without resolution. Still, for the first time through this whole mess, Marcus felt like he'd been talking to his father instead of being managed by him. 6 months later, Marcus signed the lease on that corner apartment and started dating a woman he'd met at his friend's barbecue. His parents had worked out some arrangement involving a reverse mortgage and Delilah's grudging monthly contributions. Family dinners were smaller now, but somehow more honest. Mom still barely spoke to him, but Dad had started calling just to chat. These conversations felt different, like talking to an equal instead of a client. Marcus realized he'd spent so many years being indispensable that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be simply appreciated. The inheritance fight had forced everyone to figure out the difference between being needed and being valued. Turned out, he preferred being valued. Looking back, Marcus figured the will had been a weird sort of gift. Not the money or property he'd been denied, but the clarity he'd gained about his own worth. He'd learned to tell the difference between love and convenience, between family and financial arrangement. His parents were handling their own lives now, sometimes well, sometimes not so much. Delilah had discovered that inheritance came with strings she'd never bothered to think about. The whole family dynamic had shifted from Marcus propping everyone up to everyone figuring out their own balance. Sitting in his new place on quiet evenings, watching the city lights spread out below, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten: the freedom that came from living for himself. The real inheritance he'd needed wasn't money or property. It was permission to stop sacrificing himself for people who mistook his sacrifice for weakness. Marcus adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror of his downtown office, still getting used to the promotion that had come 6 months ago. Senior project manager, not bad for someone who'd spent years thinking he couldn't afford to take risks. Funny how cutting off that monthly $800 drain had freed up more than just money. It had freed up headspace, energy, ambition he'd forgotten he had. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, the woman he'd been seeing for over a year now. Dinner at 7, she reminded him, followed by a winking emoji. She was nothing like the women he'd dated before: independent, financially stable, someone who split checks without drama and never hinted that his paycheck should solve her problems. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once he'd stopped being everyone's financial safety net, he'd actually become more attractive as a partner. Harold's voice on the phone had gotten steadier over the past few months. The reverse mortgage had bought them breathing room, and Delilah's grudging monthly contributions, smaller than what Marcus used to pay, but regular enough, kept them afloat. His father called every few weeks now, usually with stories about his woodworking projects or questions about Marcus's job. Never asking for money, that was the biggest change. Their relationship felt more genuine now, built on actual interest rather than financial necessity. Harold had even started offering advice about Marcus's career moves, treating him like an adult son instead of a walking ATM. Last month, he'd actually bragged to his retirement community friends about Marcus's promotion. The shift felt surreal sometimes, like discovering his father had been there all along, just buried under years of transactional conversations. Patricia remained a work in progress. She'd grudgingly attended Marcus's birthday dinner last month, spending most of it making passive-aggressive comments about how different everything was now. But she'd shown up, which felt like something. Her relationship with Delilah had grown complicated, gratitude mixed with resentment over the financial support, frustration with having to ask instead of assume. Delilah herself had changed in ways Marcus found fascinating to watch from a distance. The inheritance had turned out to be more burden than blessing. The house needed constant repairs, property taxes were brutal, and the monthly support payments to their parents had forced her to actually budget for the first time in her adult life. Her Instagram posts had shifted from champagne brunches to home improvement projects and complaints about contractor prices. The family Christmas gathering had been smaller but somehow warmer than previous years. Without the underlying tension of Marcus's unacknowledged sacrifice, conversations felt more balanced. Even Patricia had managed a few genuine moments, asking about Sarah and seeming actually interested in the answers. Delilah had pulled him aside during dessert, offering something that almost resembled an apology. She admitted she'd never really understood how much he'd been carrying, how much their parents had relied on him. The inheritance had opened her eyes to responsibilities she'd never considered. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. That felt like enough, honestly. Marcus had learned the difference between forgiveness and doormat behavior. He could accept her apology without resuming his old role as family banker. Standing in his apartment's kitchen 2 years later, making coffee in the quiet morning light, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed. The corner unit still felt like luxury. The city view still made him grateful. But more than the physical space, he'd claimed emotional space, room to grow, to make mistakes, to prioritize his own dreams. Sarah padded out of the bedroom in one of his shirts, hair messy from sleep, and started rummaging through his refrigerator like she belonged there, which she did increasingly. They'd talked about moving in together, about building something that was theirs instead of his or hers. The inheritance that had initially felt like betrayal had actually been liberation. His parents had forced him to value himself by showing him exactly how little they'd valued his sacrifice. Sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in the ugliest packaging.